The hum of the Sterling Corporate Center's air conditioning was Julian's constant companion, a low mechanical sigh that filled the void of the night shift. He navigated the 30th floor with the practiced ease of someone who knew every corner, every shadow, every echo. For Julian, the building was a labyrinth of ghosts, not the supernatural kind, but the ghosts of his past. Each highly polished surface reflected a memory of Sarah, his wife. She was a woman who saw not just illness but person behind it. Sarah had a way of turning every quiet moment into a teaching opportunity, especially after her long, grueling shifts as a neurosurgeon. "Julian," she'd say, pulling him close after a particularly difficult case, "you have to promise me you'll always look for the signs. The body tells a story, and you have to know how to read it. Tonight, in the heart of the corporate fortress." That promise came screaming back to him. He was pushing his cleaning cart past conference room C when he saw her. The silhouette of Eleanor Vance, the CEO, was a figure of power and control by day. But in that moment, she was reduced to a fragile, trembling form. Through the glass, Julian could see the tremor in her hands, the way she clutched her head as if trying to hold her thoughts together. He had been a widower for 2 years, and in that time, he'd perfected the art of emotional distance. It was the only way he could survive the loneliness. But watching Eleanor, a stranger, in such distress, shattered his carefully constructed defenses. A cold wave of dread washed over him. This was not a stress headache. He had seen this exact tableau play out in his living room, with Sarah pointing to diagrams and explaining the subtle, devastating onset of a stroke. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell Sarah's faint floral perfume. Eleanor's left eye began to twitch, a rapid, involuntary flutter that Julian instantly recognized as a neurological symptom. Then, her left arm slipped from the table, a lifeless weight. His mind raced through the protocols Sarah had taught him: FAST, facial drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, time to call emergency services. This wasn't a drill, this was real. Julian's hand hovered over the brass door handle, a barrier separating his world from hers. He was a janitor. She was a CEO. The company's code of conduct was clear about maintaining a professional distance from executives. Breaking that rule could cost him his job, the only source of income for him and his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. But as he watched Eleanor's face contort in confusion, her lips moving without forming coherent words, the choice was no longer about protocol. It was about a promise made to a woman he loved, a promise to honor her legacy by saving a life. Taking a deep breath, Julian pushed the door open, the sound barely a whisper. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. She tried to speak, but the words were a jumble of thick, garbled sounds. Julian's training, inherited from his late wife, took over. He knelt beside her, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm calling 911, ma'am. You need help." He didn't wait for a response. His fingers moved with practiced speed on his phone, a steady rhythm that belied the chaos in the room. He recalled Sarah's advice: speak with absolute certainty. It's the one thing that can cut through a patient's fear. He spoke directly to Eleanor, his voice a steady anchor. "You are experiencing a medical emergency. Just stay with me." He noted the time, the precise onset of symptoms, everything Sarah had taught him. The paramedics, arriving with sirens screaming, were met not with a panicked janitor, but with a man who spoke their language. Suspected CVA, left-sided weakness aphasia, onset approximately 10 minutes ago, he rattled off, his casual precision stunning them. As they loaded Eleanor onto the stretcher, she managed to grasp his sleeve with her good hand, her eyes full of a mixture of fear and wonder. "How did you—" Her voice was a fragile whisper. Julian, looking down at this once unapproachable woman, felt a profound sadness. "My wife was a neurosurgeon," he said, the words heavy with memory. "She taught me to never miss the signs. As the ambulance sped away, its sirens fading into the city's hum, Julian was left alone in the silent hallway. The conference room was now a testament to the night's events. A coffee cup tipped over, papers scattered on the floor, and a single expensive-looking pen that had fallen from Eleanor's grasp. He stood there for a long time, the weight of his actions settling over him. He had broken the rules, risked his job, and in doing so, had honored his wife's memory in the most profound way possible. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer a ghost. He was the man who had seen someone in need and had chosen to act, a man who, in his quiet way, had just saved a life. The morning after the medical crisis broke over the corporate high-rises, Julian returned home to a world that was blissfully unaware of his late-night heroics. The scent of scrambled eggs and toast filled his small, worn-out apartment as he prepared breakfast for his daughter Lily. At 9 years old, Lily was a whirlwind of imagination and bright-eyed curiosity. She was the spitting image of her mother, Sarah, with the same kind and intelligent brown eyes. Their morning ritual was a sacred and familiar comfort, a small island of normalcy in the vast ocean of his grief. As he cut Lily's toast into the shape of a dinosaur, a tradition started by Sarah, a knock at the door shattered their quiet sanctuary. It was an unexpected, jarring sound, a rare disturbance in a life he had carefully crafted to be predictable and calm. When Julian opened the door, his heart momentarily stopped. Standing on his doorstep was Eleanor Vance, the very woman he had saved hours earlier. Stripped of her corporate armor, she looked smaller, more human. She wore simple jeans and a soft blue sweater, a stark contrast to the sharp designer suits of the night before. In her hands, she held a bouquet of sunflowers, their vibrant yellow, a stark burst of color in the muted hallway. Her expression was unreadable, a complex mix of gratitude, wonder, and a profound humility. "Mr. Webb," she began, her voice hesitant. I don't even know your first name." Julian wiped his hands on his faded jeans, acutely aware of the gulf between their two worlds. His worn denim and threadbare knees felt painfully exposed next to her casual wear, which he knew must have cost more than his monthly rent. "It's Julian," he said quietly. Just then Lily, drawn by the new voice, peeked around her father's leg, her wide brown eyes studying the unfamiliar visitor with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "How are you feeling, ma'am?" she asked, her voice a small clear bell. Eleanor's face softened, a genuine warm smile transforming her features. She crouched down to Lily's level, her movements careful and deliberate. "And who is this handsome young lady?" she asked, her voice carrying a warmth Julian suspected few people ever heard. "This is Lily," Julian said, his protective hand settling on his daughter's shoulder. "Lily, this is Miss Vance. She was sick last night, and Daddy helped her feel better." Eleanor's smile grew wider, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your daddy saved my life, Lily. Do you know how incredibly special that makes him?" Lily's chest puffed out with pride, beaming at the praise for her hero. "Daddy knows lots about sick people because Mommy taught him before she went to heaven." The innocent words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She looked up at Julian, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. The truth of his sacrifice suddenly became clear. This was a man raising a child alone, working a grueling night shift to make ends meet, all while carrying the weight of a profound loss. Every hour he spent cleaning corporate offices was an hour away from his daughter. Every dollar he earned came at the cost of sleep and personal time. His heroism wasn't born of a medical degree, but of a love that transcended life itself. Eleanor stood up, her composure returning but with a new vulnerability. "I was wondering," she said carefully, "if you'd let me take you both to lunch. There's a lot I'd like to know about the man who saw what my own doctor somehow missed." Julian hesitated. The offer felt dangerous, a step into a world he didn't belong in. a world where gratitude could easily turn into a suffocating obligation. The gap between their lives felt vast and unbridgeable. Yet, something in Eleanor's expression, a loneliness that mirrored his own, made him nod slowly. "Lily would like that," he said. "She doesn't get out much on weekends." The restaurant Eleanor chose was not a posh, upscale establishment, but Mel's Pancake House, a diner on Old Route 66. It was a place of comfort food and honest conversation, where truckers and working families gathered around formica tables. Here, Eleanor seemed different, more relaxed, even laughing when Lily insisted on ordering chocolate chip pancakes for lunch, and showed her how to make towers out of sugar packets. While Lily was distracted by the vintage jukebox, Eleanor asked, "Tell me about your wife." Julian's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, finding warmth in the ceramic. "Sarah worked in stroke rehabilitation at Chicago General for 15 years, he began. "Every night she'd come home and quiz me on symptoms, patient responses, medication protocols. She'd say, 'You never know when medical knowledge might save someone's life.'" He paused, watching Lily bounce to the rhythm of an old Motown song. "She died 2 years ago in a car accident, coming home from a double shift." Eleanor reached across the scarred table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture so gentle it made his throat tighten. "I'm so sorry, Julian. And you've been raising Lily alone since then." Julian nodded, surprised by how easy it was to talk. To her, how she listened without the suffocating pity he had grown to dread. There was a genuine empathy in her gaze that invited honesty. "It's been hard," he admitted. "The night shift pays better, but it means I sleep while she's at school and work while she's asleep. We get weekends together, though. That's something." Eleanor studied his face with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "You're a remarkable man, Julian Webb," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "More remarkable than you probably realize." Their conversation continued for 2 hours, flowing with surprising ease despite the obvious differences in their backgrounds, a fragile and beautiful connection being forged between two people who, in their own ways, had been living in isolation. Weeks that followed their meeting at Mel's Pancake House saw an unlikely friendship bloom, a delicate and precious thing that existed outside the boundaries of their respective worlds. Eleanor began showing up at the diner every Sunday afternoon, a quiet ritual that Julian and Lily came to cherish. She always had an excuse. I was in the neighborhood and always brought small, thoughtful gifts for Lily, from dinosaur books to art supplies. Julian watched as Eleanor interacted with his daughter, and in her eyes, he saw a profound loneliness that mirrored his own. Despite her penthouse and private jets, Eleanor Vance ate dinner alone every night, woke up to an empty silence every morning. "She's sad like you used to be, Daddy," Lily had whispered to him one evening, "before you started smiling again." Julian realized his daughter was right. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking forward to something beyond just surviving each day. Their connection, fragile and undefined, was a source of light in the darkness they had both been living in. Eleanor even started texting Julian throughout the week, sharing photos of sunsets from her office window or funny articles she thought he would enjoy. He found himself looking forward to these small connections, these glimpses of the person behind the corporate facade, and would respond with pictures of Lily's artwork or updates on their weekend adventures. They were building a bridge across the vast chasm between their lives. Brick by careful brick, the fourth Sunday came, and Eleanor didn't appear. Julian tried to tell himself it was foolish to have expected this fragile arrangement to last. That reality had simply reasserted itself. But when Monday night brought him back to Sterling Corporate for his cleaning rounds, he found Eleanor slumped over her desk at 2:30 a.m. this time. Her symptoms were different, but equally terrifying. Her right hand trembled uncontrollably as she tried to sign documents, and when she looked up at him, her pupils were of 2 different sizes, one dilated, one constricted. "I'm calling 911, Julian said. his voice instantly dropping into the calm, authoritative tone he'd used before. But Eleanor shook her head with desperate urgency. "No, please. If the board finds out I'm having more medical episodes, they'll remove me as CEO. Marcus Thorne has been waiting for any excuse to stage a coup." Julian's fingers stilled on his phone, the weight of her dilemma pressing down on him. She was caught between her health and her career, between survival and the empire she'd spent decades building. "Eleanor, this is your life we're talking about," he pleaded, but even as he said it, he understood her impossible position. A CEO showing signs of serious neurological problems would be voted out faster than the paperwork could be filed. "Let me drive you to the hospital myself," Julian offered, a solution forming in his mind. "We'll say you're there for routine tests, preventive care. No ambulance, no corporate notification, no emergency room drama." Her expression, a mix of gratitude and fear, tightened his chest with an emotion he wasn't ready to acknowledge. They were moving into territory far beyond gratitude, into a dangerous entanglement that could change both their lives irrevocably. The emergency room at Chicago General was like stepping into Julian's past. These were the halls where Sarah had worked, where he'd spent countless hours waiting for her to finish shifts. Dr. Lena Sharma, one of Sarah's former colleagues, took one look at Eleanor's symptoms and immediately ordered a comprehensive neurological workup. "These aren't stress symptoms," she told them bluntly. "This is serious brain chemistry dysfunction. We need to find out what's causing it before permanent damage occurs." While they waited for test results, Eleanor reached for Julian's hand with surprising urgency. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for tonight, but for seeing me. Really seeing me as a person, not just a title." Julian looked down at their intertwined fingers, her manicured nails against his work-roughened skin, and felt a profound sense of connection. "Sarah believed that everyone deserves to be treated like a human being first," he said softly. Dr. Sharma returned with results that drained the color from Eleanor's face and made Julian's inherited medical knowledge scream. Warnings. The brain scan showed multiple small areas of damage consistent with repeated mini-strokes, the kind that often go undetected. "Ms. Vance, you need immediate intervention," Dr. Sharma explained. "Blood thinners, lifestyle modifications, and, most importantly, we need to identify why these episodes keep happening. This pattern isn't random. There's an underlying cause we're missing." Eleanor squeezed Julian's hand tighter, her composure finally cracking. "My personal physician has been monitoring me for months. Dr. Douglas assured me everything was within normal parameters." Dr. Sharma's expression grew troubled, then suspicious. "I'd like to review those test results if you don't mind, because what I'm seeing here suggests either gross medical negligence or something far more deliberate." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Eleanor's hand began to shake. Not from neurological symptoms this time, but from pure fear. Julian's mind was already racing through the possibilities, none of them good. A physician with access to Eleanor's complete medical history, someone who could manipulate test results or delay a critical diagnosis, someone who might have financial incentives to keep the CEO in declining health. "We need to see those test results," Julian said grimly. "All of them. And we need to see them tonight." What they discovered in Eleanor's medical files over the next several hours was a calculated act of malice that turned Julian's stomach. Every blood test, every brain scan, every diagnostic procedure had been subtly but deliberately falsified. The data was not overtly wrong, but just enough to hide the progressive cardiovascular damage that should have triggered immediate intervention months earlier. Eleanor's blood pressure readings were reported as normal when they were dangerously elevated. Her cholesterol levels were fudged downward, inflammatory markers minimized, and neurological function tests deliberately misinterpreted. It was a systematic cover-up, gambling with her life for a purpose that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. The evidence was damning. A meticulously planned conspiracy that had been unfolding right under her nose. Marcus. Thorne, Eleanor whispered, the name hanging in the sterile hospital conference room like a curse. He's been positioning himself as my successor for 2 years. If I died or became medically incapacitated, he'd automatically assume control of the company. Julian stared at the falsified documents spread across the table, his hands shaking, with a silent rage at the sheer cruelty of it all. This wasn't just a corporate rivalry. It was attempted murder disguised as medical care. "We need to contact the FBI," Julian said, his voice hard. But Eleanor shook her head with a bitter, world-weary practicality. With what concrete proof? "Thorne is too intelligent to leave obvious fingerprints, and Dr. Douglas will claim he was following standard protocols. If I make accusations I can't definitively prove, Thorne will destroy my reputation and my company before I can gather more evidence." She began pacing the small room like a caged animal, her mind already racing through the complex landscape of corporate warfare. Besides, who's going to believe that a Fortune 500 CEO was repeatedly saved by a night janitor who learned medicine from his deceased wife? The story sounds like fiction. Her words stung Julian, not because they were intended to wound, but because they highlighted the brutal reality of their situation. In Eleanor's world of boardrooms and power brokers, his inherited knowledge meant nothing without the right credentials or social standing. He was a nobody, a ghost, and that fact alone could discredit their entire story. But as Julian watched her, an audacious idea began to form. "Maybe that's exactly why this story matters," he said quietly, his voice full of a new resolve. "Maybe the fact that I'm nobody special is what makes this narrative powerful. A working-class janitor with inherited medical knowledge saving a CEO's life not once, but twice, while her expensive private physician missed obvious warning signs. The media would absolutely love this story." Eleanor stopped pacing and stared at him with something that might have been hope mixed with terror. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. Julian took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would change both their lives irrevocably. "We go public. We tell the whole story. How a janitor spotted symptoms that a board-certified physician somehow missed. How corporate medicine failed where basic human observation succeeded. If Thorne has been planning to take over after your death or incapacitation, having your survival become a national news sensation completely ruins his timeline." The plan was terrifying in its implications, yet brilliant in its simplicity. Julian would tell his story to the media, the night janitor whose late wife's medical knowledge had saved Eleanor Vance's life twice while her personal physician missed textbook stroke symptoms. The human interest angle would be irresistible. Classic David versus Goliath story, a working-class hero. The triumph of basic human decency over corporate indifference. "If Thorne's been orchestrating this medical conspiracy," Julian explained, "public scrutiny will force his hand. He'll have to make some kind of move to protect himself, and when he does, we'll be ready to document it." Eleanor studied his face with a mixture of admiration and horror. "You're talking about destroying your privacy, Julian. Your quiet life, Lily's safety, your ability to work anonymously. He'd be sacrificing everything." Julian thought about Lily, about the world he wanted to leave for her. A world where the truth could stand on its own, regardless of who told it. He thought about Sarah's fundamental belief that medical knowledge should serve humanity, regardless of social status. "Some things are worth the sacrifice," he said simply. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, like a bomb detonating in the corporate media landscape. The Chicago Tribune ran it on the front page with a headline that captured the public's imagination. "Night janitor's medical knowledge saves CEO's life twice." By noon, every major news outlet in the country was running variations of the story, and Julian's phone hadn't stopped ringing since. 6 a.m. news vans lined the street outside his apartment building, reporters shoving microphones in his face every time he tried to leave. Lily was safely at school, but Julian knew their quiet life was over forever. The most important call came from FBI agent Sarah Martinez, who had been investigating financial irregularities at Sterling Corporate for 8 months as part of a broader probe into healthcare fraud. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, "we've been looking for exactly the kind of insider testimony you can provide. Are you willing to help us build a criminal case against the people who endangered Ms. Vance's life?" Julian looked out his window at the media circus his life had become and thought about Eleanor, about Lily, about all the people who might be saved if they could stop Thorne and his conspiracy. "Yes," he said without hesitation, "but I want guarantees about Eleanor's safety. She's a victim in this situation, not a co-conspirator." Agent Martinez assured him that Eleanor would be treated as a witness rather than a suspect. Within hours, Julian found himself in a federal building downtown, telling his story to a room full of investigators who hung on every word. His working-class accent and obvious sincerity made him a compelling witness, and when he described watching Eleanor's symptoms with knowledge inherited from his late wife, several seasoned agents had to look away. "I didn't save Eleanor Vance because she was a CEO," Julian told them. "I saved her because she was a human being in medical crisis, and I had the knowledge to help. That's what Sarah would have wanted me to do." The human element of his story became the cornerstone of their investigation, turning abstract financial crimes into a real and urgent case of attempted murder. The FBI investigation moved with a speed that both astonished and terrified Julian and Eleanor. Having Julian's testimony and Eleanor's falsified medical records as a starting point, Agent Sarah Martinez and her team were able to follow the breadcrumbs of Marcus Thorne's arrogance. He had been so confident in his plot that he'd left a digital paper trail, connecting him to Dr. Douglas through a series of offshore accounts and shell companies. The physician had been receiving regular payments disguised as consulting fees, with a bonus structure directly tied to Eleanor's declining health metrics. The cold, calculated nature of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its cruelty. Within 2 weeks, both men were under federal arrest, charged with conspiracy, healthcare fraud, and attempted murder. The medical board immediately stripped Dr. Douglas of his license, and Thorne's corporate assets were frozen pending trial. The house of cards they had so meticulously built came crashing down in spectacular fashion, all because a janitor had refused to be invisible. Julian was called to testify before a federal grand jury. He walked into the intimidating courtroom, not as a janitor or a widower, but as the key witness in a high-profile criminal case. His quiet dignity and obvious honesty made him an exceptionally credible witness. He didn't speak the language of corporate finance or legal jargon, but he spoke the language of humanity. He described watching Eleanor's symptoms with knowledge inherited from his late wife, Sarah, and the prosecutors later told him that his testimony had been the cornerstone of their case. "I didn't save Eleanor Vance because she was a CEO," he had told the jury. "I saved her because she was a human being in medical crisis, and I had the knowledge to help. That's what Sarah would have wanted me to do." His words resonated, turning the complex case of financial and medical fraud into a simple, urgent matter of right and wrong. Thorne was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, while Dr. Douglas received 15 years and a permanent revocation of his medical license. The Sterling corporate board, rocked by the scandal, underwent a complete restructuring with new policies that required independent medical oversight for all executive health programs. Eleanor was publicly and professionally vindicated. Her reputation wasn't just restored. It was enhanced by her bravery and cooperation with federal investigators. But personal victory came with unexpected costs that neither she nor Julian had fully anticipated. The media attention had made Julian a minor celebrity, a role he despised. It had also made him effectively unemployable in his previous profession. Corporate cleaning services didn't want to hire someone who might recognize their clients from television appearances. And his anonymity, the very shield he relied on to protect his quiet life with his daughter Lily, was gone forever. Eleanor, in her gratitude, tried to offer him a position in Sterling's new employee wellness program, a role that would have provided him with security and a steady income. But Julian declined with a gentle firmness. "I appreciate the offer more than you know," he told Eleanor one final time in her office, surrounded by the symbols of power and achievement that defined her world. "But I think we both understand that the media circus changed everything between us." Eleanor's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerable woman he'd found in the conference room months earlier. "Does it have to change everything?" she asked quietly, and Julian heard the loneliness in her voice, a loneliness no amount of professional success could ever fill. He looked around the vast office, at the expansive windows overlooking the city, at the symbols of power and achievement that would always separate their worlds. "I think it already has," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean what happened between us was wrong. It was probably the most right thing either of us has done in years." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. They had saved each other in ways that transcended medicine and corporate intrigue, but some bridges, he realized, were meant to be crossed only once. Their connection was too powerful, too public, and too different from their respective realities to be contained in a conventional relationship. They were two people from opposite ends of the world who had met in a moment of crisis, and while they had changed each other's lives, a lasting, everyday relationship was a beautiful fantasy that reality had no room for. As he left her office for the last time, Julian knew that their story was over, but the memories, the quiet strength of their shared experience, would remain with him forever. It was a bittersweet victory, one that had cost him his old life, but had also given him a new, unexpected sense of purpose. He was no longer just a janitor, but a man who had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, had honored the memory of the woman he loved. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like his own to build. A year passed. For Julian, it was a year of transformation, a journey from the invisible man of the night shift to a man with a purpose he'd never anticipated. With the money from a surprise book deal, a memoir titled The Quiet Authority, and the speaking engagements that followed, he had purchased the ground floor of what had once been a Sterling corporate satellite building. He transformed the space into the Second Sight Art Studio, a haven for stroke survivors. Here, the walls weren't adorned with corporate awards, but with vibrant, sometimes shaky, paintings created by people relearning how to use their hands and find their voice. The quiet dignity of his work felt more fulfilling than any job he'd ever known. He taught his clients not just how to hold a paintbrush, but how to find patience, how to see beauty in imperfection, and how to accept help. He watched with profound pride as Lily, now 10, moved through the studio with a natural grace, helping an elderly stroke survivor relearn how to hold a brush. Her patience and empathy were a direct inheritance from her mother, Sarah. Life had settled into a new, gentle rhythm. But there was one constant that connected his new world to his old one: Eleanor. He knew she still drove past his studio every Friday afternoon. He'd catch a glimpse of her familiar black sedan slowing down as it passed, her silhouette visible for a moment behind the tinted windows. She never stopped, never knocked, never acknowledged his presence directly. Lily had asked him once why the pretty lady with the flowers didn't visit anymore, and Julian had struggled to explain the complexities of their connection. Sometimes people care about each other in ways that don't fit into normal categories. He'd finally told his daughter, "That doesn't make the caring any less real or less important." Lily, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who have learned early that life doesn't always follow storybook patterns, had simply accepted this explanation. One blustery Tuesday in autumn, however, the ritual changed. As Julian was tidying up the studio, he saw Eleanor's car park across the street for longer than usual. He watched through the large windows as she got out and approached the front door. She leaned a package, wrapped in simple brown paper, against the door. Without knocking, then returned to her car and drove away. Julian waited several minutes, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Before retrieving the package, he unwrapped it to reveal a painting. It was amateur, deeply felt and undeniably beautiful. It showed him and Lily working together in the studio, seen from the perspective of someone watching through glass. The perspective was hers, and the love and loss embedded in every brushstroke were palpable. On the back, in her careful handwriting, were just 3 words, "What I see." Julian studied the painting for a long time, tears welling in his eyes. She had captured the light falling across Lily's concentrated face, the gentle attention in Aza's attention, the light falling across Lily's concentrated face, his own posture as he guided his daughter's hand. It was a masterpiece of emotional truth. The following Monday, Julian created his own painting. It was a watercolor showing Lily teaching an elderly stroke survivor to paint sunflowers, an image of hope and healing. He placed it by the studio door, titled simply, "What We Become." When Friday arrived, Eleanor's car appeared right on schedule. Julian watched through the window as she discovered his response. She studied the painting for several minutes before carefully placing it in her car alongside her own. The pattern continued through the changing seasons. Every Friday, Eleanor would park across the street, watch the studio for exactly 10 minutes, and then drive away. Sometimes she brought a painting, sometimes she simply sat in her car observing. Occasionally, Julian would catch her eye through the window, and they would look at each other across the distance that had become their silent, poignant method of staying connected. It was a bond that existed in the spaces between conventional relationships, a testament to a love that was too big and too complicated for a normal life. As winter settled over Chicago, Julian found an unexpected peace in the rhythm of his transformed life. Teaching art therapy filled him with a sense of purpose that his previous work had never provided. Watching Lily grow into a confident, compassionate girl who could explain brain anatomy to curious visitors made him proud in ways he'd never imagined. And accepting Eleanor's quiet Friday afternoon presence as a blessing that didn't require explanation or resolution gave him a kind of emotional stability he'd never expected to find again. There were moments when he wondered what might have been possible if they'd been different people from the same social world, free to love without the weight of media attention and class differences. But those moments passed like snowflakes melting on a warm glass, leaving behind something clearer and more enduring than romantic fantasy. Some connections, Julian had learned, transcended the human need for definition or conventional resolution. Some relationships were meant to exist in the spaces between traditional categories, expressing care through distance rather than closeness. He had saved her life, and she, in turn, had shown him how to live again. Their love was a quiet, constant presence, a masterpiece painted from a distance, forever captured in the simple, beautiful exchange of what they saw and what they had become.